Margaret Holloway, a 55-year-old retired teacher from Dayton, Ohio, was supposed to be safe in her own home. But when she fell for her much younger caregiver, Daniel Carter, passion turned into possession, and love turned lethal. On June 14, 2023, a chilling crime unfolded inside Margaret's quiet suburban home. One of them wouldn't make it out alive. Was this a tragic love story gone wrong? Or was something far more sinister at play? Stay with us as we uncover the shocking truth behind the affair that led to murder. Holloway had spent most of her life in Dayton, Ohio. She was a retired schoolteacher, known for her patience and warmth. In her prime, she had been a dedicated mother to her two children, Rebecca and Thomas, and a beloved mentor to hundreds of students. But life had not been kind in recent years. After her husband's passing, Margaret found herself alone in the same house they had built together. A house once filled with laughter but now drowning in silence. By the time she reached her mid-50s, Margaret's health began to decline. Years of stress and medical conditions had left her frail, and simple tasks became difficult. Her children, both of whom had families of their own, decided it was best to hire an in-home caregiver. It wasn't an easy decision. Margaret was independent and stubborn, hesitant to let a stranger into her home. But in the end she agreed. And that's when Daniel Carter entered her life. Daniel was 32 years old, tall, with dark eyes that carried a mix of charm and mystery. He had worked as a caregiver for several years, assisting elderly patients with daily tasks. To the outside world, he seemed like a devoted professional, someone who genuinely cared about his clients. But Daniel had a past, one he never spoke about. He had struggled with financial problems, a history of failed relationships, and a personality that could shift from charming to controlling in an instant. When he met Margaret, he saw more than just another patient. He saw an opportunity, the unlikely bond. At first, their relationship was purely professional. Daniel helped Margaret with groceries, prepared her meals, and managed her medications. But it wasn't long before their conversations became more personal. Margaret, who had been lonely for years, found comfort in Daniel's presence. He was attentive, listening to her stories about her youth, her late husband, and the dreams she once had. Daniel, in return, knew exactly what to say. He flattered her, told her she was beautiful, that age was just a number. For the first time in years, Margaret felt desired. She knew it was wrong. After all, Daniel was young enough to be her son, but the attention was intoxicating. What started as harmless flirtation soon turned into something deeper. Late-night conversations turned into lingering touches. Glances became more meaningful. And before Margaret could process what was happening, she was in the middle of a full-fledged affair with the one man who was supposed to take care of her. At first, Margaret felt alive. She had spent years feeling invisible, just another aging woman in a world that no longer noticed her. But with Daniel, she felt young again. She dressed differently, started wearing makeup again, and even changed the way she spoke. Her children, especially Rebecca, noticed the shift. Rebecca would later recall that her mother started avoiding family gatherings. Phone calls became brief, and visits to the house felt different. Daniel was always around, watching, listening. He wasn't just her caregiver anymore. He had become her shadow. At first, Margaret defended him. She told Rebecca and Thomas that Daniel was just being protective, that he was like family now. But the truth was, Margaret wasn't in control of the relationship anymore. Daniel was. As the months passed, Daniel's grip on Margaret tightened. What had started as affection turned into something far more dangerous. He dictated what she wore, who she spoke to, and how she spent her money. Margaret's bank accounts, once stable, began to show unusual withdrawals. Expensive gifts appeared in the house. Watches, clothes, electronics, all of them for Daniel. He convinced Margaret that she deserved to spend money on happiness, but the happiness was one-sided. Then came the isolation. Margaret's friends stopped visiting. She stopped answering calls. Whenever Rebecca or Thomas came over, Daniel was always there, standing too close, speaking for Margaret, ensuring she never had a moment alone. By now, Margaret knew she had made a mistake. She had allowed a man into her life who was not just possessive but dangerous. But there was no easy way out. Because Daniel had a temper. Rebecca was the first to notice the bruises. During one of her rare visits, she saw faint purple marks on her mother's wrist. When she asked about them, Margaret laughed it off. "Oh, I'm just clumsy," she had said. But the way she avoided eye contact told a different story. Then the neighbors started whispering. Late at night, they had heard shouting from Margaret's house. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Wilkins, claimed she had seen Daniel storm out of the house in the middle of the night, his face twisted in rage. Margaret's world was closing in. She was trapped. too ashamed to ask for help, too scared to leave. And Daniel knew it. By early June 2023, Margaret was on edge. She had started hiding money, secretly calling Rebecca when Daniel was out of the house. She knew she had to escape. But Daniel was always watching. On the night of June 14th, the walls finally caved in. A heated argument erupted between them, this time louder, more violent than before. Margaret wanted out, but Daniel refused to let her go. Accusations flew, voices rose, and in a moment of blind rage, someone snapped. By morning one of them would be dead. But who? And why? The truth was about to unravel, and the quiet town of Dayton, Ohio, would never be the same again. Margaret Holloway had spent years feeling invisible. After her husband's passing, life had grown monotonous. Just doctor's visits, old photo albums, and waiting for phone calls that rarely came. But Daniel Carter changed everything. He made her feel seen, desired, alive. What began as simple companionship soon spiraled into something neither of them had planned, an affair built on secrecy, obsession, and a looming sense of danger. Margaret wasn't naive. She knew the whispers that would follow if anyone found out she was involved with a man 23 years younger. But Daniel had a way of making her forget about the judgment of others. "It's just you and me, Margaret," he would say, his hand resting on hers. "No one else needs to know." At first she believed it was a romance, something rare and beautiful. Their secret meetings were thrilling. Daniel would stay late after his shifts, the air between them charged with something forbidden. He would bring her flowers, cheap ones from the grocery store, but to Margaret they felt like a grand gesture. He made her laugh, told her she was beautiful. She hadn't felt that way in years. But what Margaret didn't see, what she refused to see, was that Daniel wasn't in this for love. He was in it for control. Margaret's children, Rebecca and Thomas, had always been close with their mother. Even as they built their own families, they made sure to visit, to call. But after Daniel entered the picture, Margaret started pulling away. At first it was small things, missed phone calls, canceled lunches. Then it got worse. When they did visit, she seemed different, more distant, jumpy almost. And Daniel was always there, hovering nearby, his presence a constant shadow in the room. Rebecca, the more perceptive of the two, had her suspicions. "There's something off about him," she told Thomas one afternoon. "Mom's acting weird. And why is he always around? He's just her caregiver. He's not family." Thomas shrugged. "Maybe she's just lonely. Maybe she trusts him." Rebecca wasn't convinced. One evening she stopped by unexpectedly. As she pulled into the driveway, she saw something that made her heart sink. Through the window, her mother and Daniel were sitting close, too close, their hands touching in a way that wasn't friendly. Margaret was laughing like a schoolgirl. Daniel leaned in, whispering something in her ear. Rebecca's stomach churned. Something was very, very wrong. Soon, Daniel's influence over Margaret became undeniable. He wasn't just her caregiver, he was in control of every part of her life. He answered the phone when her children called, often saying Margaret was resting or not feeling well. He was the one who handled her finances, picking up groceries, medications, even managing her bills. Margaret, once a strong-willed woman, started deferring to him for everything. Her closest friends noticed it too. One of them, Linda Matthews, had been Margaret's neighbor for over 15 years. They used to meet for coffee every Sunday, a ritual that Margaret cherished. But lately Margaret had stopped coming. One day Linda knocked on her door. Daniel answered. "She's sleeping," he said, blocking the doorway. "It's not a good time." Linda frowned. "I'll wait." "She doesn't want visitors right now," Daniel insisted, his voice firm. It was the way he said it, the finality in his tone, that sent chills down Linda's spine. That was the last time she ever tried to see Margaret. Emotional manipulation. Margaret wasn't blind to what was happening. Somewhere deep down, she knew Daniel was taking over her life. But every time she tried to question it, he had an answer. "Your kids don't care about you like I do," he told her one night, his voice smooth like honey. "They only visit out of obligation. I'm the one who's here every day, Margaret. I'm the one who makes sure you're okay." And Margaret, fragile and starved for affection, believed him. Slowly she started to see her children differently. She stopped answering their calls, convinced that maybe they didn't care as much as they once did. Maybe they were just waiting for her to die. Daniel was the only one who truly loved her. At least that's what he made her believe. Jealousy and control. As the relationship deepened, so did Daniel's possessiveness. He hated when Margaret spoke to anyone else, especially men. One afternoon, a handyman came by to fix a leaky pipe. He was an older man, friendly, making small talk with Margaret as he worked. Daniel watched the interaction like a hawk. As soon as the handyman left, Daniel's demeanor shifted. He slammed the door shut, turning to Margaret with dark, narrowed eyes. "Who was that?" he demanded. Margaret frowned. "Just the plumber." "Why?" Daniel stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You were flirting with him." Margaret's heart pounded. "What? No. You think I don't see the way you smile at other men?" he hissed. "Do you think I'm stupid?" Margaret felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. She had never seen him like this before. "I wasn't." Daniel grabbed her wrist, not hard but enough to make her freeze. Enough to make her realize just how much power he had over her. "I don't like sharing," he said. That was the first time Margaret felt truly afraid. By now, the relationship was no longer just a secret. It was a burden. A dangerous, suffocating trap that Margaret couldn't escape. Her money was disappearing, her friends had been pushed away, and the man she once thought loved her had turned into something else. Something controlling. Something cruel. She thought about ending things. About telling him to leave. But every time she tried, something stopped her. Fear. Because Daniel wasn't just controlling, he was unpredictable. And Margaret knew that if she pushed him too far, there would be consequences. So she stayed silent. She played along. Until one night when the truth finally came crashing down. The beginning of the end. It was a quiet evening when Margaret finally broke. Sitting in her dimly lit living room, staring at her reflection in the darkened window, she saw a woman she no longer recognized. She picked up the phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed her daughter's number. It rang once, twice, then a shadow moved behind her. A hand reached over, pressing the phone back onto the receiver. Margaret's breath hitched. Daniel stood there, eyes cold, expression unreadable. "Who were you calling?" he asked, voice calm but laced with something dangerous. Margaret's mouth went dry. "No one." Daniel didn't blink. "Don't lie to me." She swallowed hard. I just wanted to talk to Rebecca." Daniel tilted his head, studying her like a predator watching its prey. "We talked about this, Margaret." She nodded quickly, heart hammering. "I know. I'm sorry." Daniel's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "That's my girl." Margaret forced a smile, but inside she knew. She was running out of time. June 14, 2023, was supposed to be just another evening in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Dayton, Ohio. But inside the Holloway residence, tensions had reached their breaking point. The air was thick with unease, the walls of the once cozy home now closing in on Margaret Holloway and Daniel Carter. Their relationship, built on secrecy, manipulation, and obsession, had finally imploded. The first sign of trouble came around 9:45 p.m. when neighbors heard shouting from inside Margaret's home. It wasn't unusual for arguments to erupt between them, but this time, something felt different. More urgent. More dangerous. Linda Matthews, Margaret's longtime neighbor, later recalled the sounds. It was loud. Like real screaming. "I heard something slam against the wall, and then it just went silent. Completely silent." Then, at exactly 9:57 p.m., a single gunshot rang out. The 911 call came in at 10:02 p.m. It was Margaret herself who dialed, her voice trembling as she whispered, "He's dead. I shot him." When officers arrived, they found Margaret sitting on the floor in her living room, the gun resting on the coffee table just inches away. Her hands were shaking, her face pale. Daniel Carter's body lay sprawled across the floor, blood pooling around him. The gunshot had struck him in the chest, piercing his lung. He had bled out in minutes. Margaret didn't resist when officers took her into custody. She was eerily calm, almost as if she were in shock. When asked what had happened, she simply muttered, "I had no choice." But was that the truth? Investigators quickly got to work, trying to unravel the sequence of events that led to Daniel's death. The crime scene told a chaotic story. The living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, picture frames shattered. A lamp had been knocked over, its bulb flickering weakly. It was clear there had been a struggle. But the most chilling detail was the overturned chair near the kitchen. It had deep scratch marks along its wooden surface, as if someone had been desperately trying to hold on. Margaret claimed Daniel had attacked her, that she had fired the gun in self-defense. But as detectives examined the scene, doubts began to surface. The coroner's report revealed something unexpected. Daniel Carter had been shot at close range, no more than 3 feet away. The angle of the bullet suggested he had been facing Margaret when he was hit. But here was the twist. The gunshot wound showed no defensive wounds around it. No signs that Daniel had been lunging toward Margaret, no indication of a struggle at the moment he was shot. Even more puzzling, Daniel's arms and knuckles showed old bruises, signs that he had been in multiple altercations over the past weeks. Had there been previous fights between them that had never been reported? Then there was the strangest discovery of all. Underneath Daniel's fingernails, forensic experts found traces of skin. Not his own but Margaret's. Scratches lined her forearm, faint but fresh. Had Daniel really been the aggressor that night? Or had Margaret been fighting for her life? During her interrogation, Margaret was quiet at first. She sat motionless, staring at the floor. But when detectives pressed her, the floodgates opened. "He wouldn't let me go," she whispered. "He told me, if I ever tried to leave he'd make sure I never saw my kids again. That night he found out I was trying to get away. He snapped." According to Margaret, the argument started when Daniel discovered she had spoken to her daughter, Rebecca, earlier that day. Margaret had told Rebecca that she was scared, that things had gotten worse. Daniel had been furious. "He grabbed me. He pushed me against the wall. He was screaming that I belonged to him, that I couldn't just walk away." She claimed she managed to break free, running to the bedroom where she kept the small handgun her late husband had left behind. It had been locked away for years, untouched, until that night. "I didn't want to use it. I just wanted to scare him." But when Daniel lunged at her, she pulled the trigger. At first, Margaret's story seemed plausible. The signs of struggle, the bruises, the scratches, everything pointed to an act of self-defense. But detectives weren't convinced. Something wasn't adding up. For one, why hadn't Margaret reported Daniel's abuse earlier? If she had truly been in fear for her life, why wait until now to fight back? Then there was the biggest question of all. Why was the gun found neatly placed on the coffee table? If Margaret had fired in a moment of panic, wouldn't she have dropped it in shock? Wouldn't there have been fingerprints smeared in the blood as she tried to comprehend what had just happened? Instead, the scene looked almost staged. Then came a crucial revelation. Daniel Carter had a life insurance policy. And the beneficiary? Margaret Holloway. Investigators discovered that just a few months prior, Daniel had taken out a $100,000 life insurance policy, listing Margaret as the sole recipient. The policy had been active for only 90 days before his death. Was this a coincidence, or a motive? The trial begins. Margaret was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The case divided the town. Was she a battered woman who had finally defended herself, or had she orchestrated the perfect crime? Her defense attorney painted a picture of an abused woman who had been pushed to the brink, while prosecutors argued that Margaret had been in control the entire time, waiting for the right moment to eliminate Daniel once and for all. The jury would have to decide, was Margaret Holloway a victim, or a killer? After weeks of emotional testimonies, forensic evidence, and psychological evaluations, the jury reached a decision. Margaret Holloway was found guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The court acknowledged that while she had been in a toxic, abusive relationship, there was evidence suggesting she had planned to kill Daniel before that fateful night. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. As she was led away in handcuffs, her face remained unreadable. Was it relief? Regret? Or something else entirely? The Holloway case left behind more questions than answers. Was Margaret truly a victim who snapped in a moment of fear, or had she outplayed everyone, turning the narrative in her favor? One thing was certain, this was not just a crime of passion. It was a love story gone terribly, fatally wrong. The morning after Daniel Carter's death, the Holloway residence was no longer just a home, it was a crime scene. Yellow police tape stretched across the front yard, and officers moved in and out of the house, documenting every detail. Detectives Robert Callahan and Lisa Monroe were assigned to the case. Both seasoned investigators, they had seen their fair share of domestic disputes that ended in tragedy. But something about this one didn't sit right. Margaret Holloway claimed she had acted in self-defense, yet something about the way the scene was arranged felt too neat, too deliberate. As forensic teams combed through the house, a troubling picture emerged. Blood spatter analysis. The blood pattern on the floor suggested that Daniel had been shot while standing, then collapsed backward. However, the lack of defensive wounds raised suspicions. If he had been attacking Margaret, wouldn't he have put up more of a fight? The gun's placement. The handgun was found on the coffee table, perfectly positioned. If Margaret had truly fired in panic, why hadn't she dropped it? Or if Daniel had been struggling with her, why weren't there smudges or fingerprints in the blood? Signs of a struggle. Furniture had been overturned, a lamp was broken, and there were deep scratch marks on a nearby wooden chair. It looked like a fight had taken place, but had it been staged? Detective Callahan surveyed the room and shook his head. Something's off here, he muttered. At the police station, Margaret Holloway sat in the interrogation room, her hands folded on the table. She looked exhausted, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying. When detectives entered, she exhaled shakily. "I never wanted this to happen," she whispered. She repeated the same story. Daniel had become enraged after finding out she had spoken to her daughter, Rebecca. He had grabbed her, shoved her against the wall. In fear, she ran to the bedroom, grabbed the gun, and when he lunged at her, she pulled the trigger. "I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop." But something didn't add up. Days later, the coroner's report arrived, bringing more questions than answers. Gunshot analysis. Daniel had been shot at close range, approximately 3 feet away. But the bullet's trajectory suggested he was standing still when he was shot, not lunging as Margaret had claimed. Lack of defensive wounds. If Daniel had been attacking Margaret, he would have likely tried to shield himself when the gun was fired. But there were no defensive wounds on his hands or arms. Bruising and scratches. Daniel's body showed old bruises, evidence of past physical altercations. Margaret's forearms had fresh scratches as though she had been in a struggle. But who had attacked whom? Detective Monroe tapped the report and looked at Callahan. "This doesn't scream self-defense. It screams premeditation." As detectives interviewed people who knew the couple, a new picture of their relationship came into focus. Neighbors reported frequent arguments. Several neighbors admitted they had heard loud fights between Margaret and Daniel for months. One claimed to have seen Margaret crying outside on multiple occasions. Friends noticed a change in Margaret. Her close friend Linda Matthews revealed that Margaret had been distant, avoiding calls and visits. When asked if Daniel had been abusive, Linda hesitated. "She never said it outright, but I could tell she was scared of him." Rebecca's concerns. Margaret's daughter told investigators that her mother had mentioned wanting to leave Daniel. She said she was done with him. That she was afraid of what he might do if she tried to leave. If Margaret had been afraid for her life, why hadn't she reported Daniel's behavior before? Then came the biggest revelation of all. Detectives uncovered a $100,000 life insurance policy in Daniel Carter's name. The sole beneficiary? Margaret Holloway. The policy had been active for only 3 months before Daniel's death. A chilling possibility emerged. Had Margaret planned this all along? Detective Callahan looked over the documents and sighed. Either she's the unluckiest woman alive, or she knew exactly what she was doing. With new evidence in hand, detectives brought Margaret in for questioning again. This time the tone was different. "We know about the life insurance, Margaret," Monroe said, placing the documents on the table. "We also know Daniel wasn't lunging at you when he was shot." Margaret's face drained of color. I didn't do this for money," she stammered. "I just wanted to be free of him." "Then why not leave?" Callahan pressed. "Why not go to the police before this?" Margaret shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't understand. He wouldn't let me." Tears welled in her eyes, but the detectives had seen this before. Was she a terrified woman who had finally defended herself? Or was this an act to cover up a calculated crime? The prosecution's perspective. With all the evidence gathered, prosecutors built their case. Margaret had motive, the life insurance policy. Margaret had opportunity. She was alone with Daniel the night of the shooting. The forensic evidence didn't fully support her self-defense claim. Still, there was reasonable doubt. Margaret had injuries. There were signs of a struggle. Could a jury be convinced that she had no other choice but to shoot? As news of the investigation spread, the case divided the community. Some saw Margaret as a victim, a woman who had been pushed too far by an abusive, controlling man. Others believed she had manipulated the situation, carefully setting the stage for murder. Rebecca, Margaret's daughter, made a public statement. "My mother was scared. She did what she had to do." But Daniel's sister, Emily Carter, saw it differently. She had a plan. "My brother didn't deserve this." With both sides of the story clashing, one thing became clear: the truth wasn't black and white. It was buried somewhere in the details, waiting to be uncovered in court. By the time the investigation wrapped up, Margaret Holloway had been formally charged with second-degree murder. Would a jury believe her story of self-defense? Or would they see through the cracks in her narrative? As she sat in her jail cell awaiting trial, one question lingered. Had she truly been fighting for her life that night? Or had she just committed the perfect crime? By the time Margaret Holloway's trial began, the case had captivated the entire town of Dayton, Ohio. Some saw her as a battered woman who had finally fought back. Others believed she had coldly planned Daniel Carter's murder. The courtroom was packed on the first day, reporters lined up outside, eager to capture every detail. Margaret sat at the defense table, dressed in a simple navy blue dress, her face pale and expression unreadable. The prosecution was ready to paint her as a manipulative woman who had everything to gain from Daniel's death. Would the jury see her as a victim, or a killer? The prosecution wasted no time laying out their argument. Margaret had motive. Daniel had a $100,000 life insurance policy with Margaret as the sole beneficiary. Margaret had opportunity, she was alone with Daniel that night, and no one could contradict her version of events. The crime scene was suspicious. The gun was neatly placed on the coffee table, as if she had staged the moment after the shooting. The forensic evidence didn't fully support self-defense. Daniel had no defensive wounds, and the bullet's trajectory suggested he wasn't attacking when he was shot. The prosecution called on forensic experts, who testified that the evidence did not confirm Margaret's claim that she shot Daniel in self-defense. The gunshot angle, the blood spatter, the way Daniel's body was positioned, it all pointed to him standing still, not lunging forward. Then came the most damning testimony, Daniel's life insurance agent. The agent confirmed that Daniel had taken out the policy just 3 months before his death, and Margaret had been insistent on making sure the paperwork was in order. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Was this a grieving woman who had been trapped in an abusive relationship? Or had she been waiting for the perfect moment to eliminate Daniel and cash in? Margaret's defense team took a very different approach. Margaret was a victim of abuse. They painted Daniel as a controlling, violent man who had tormented her for years. She acted in self-defense. Margaret feared for her life when Daniel attacked her that night. There was physical evidence of a struggle. Margaret had bruises and scratches, proving there had been a fight before the shooting. She had no prior history of violence. Margaret was a mother, a retired nurse, and had no criminal record. Margaret's defense attorney, Julia Reynolds, spoke with quiet intensity as she addressed the jury. Imagine being trapped in a relationship where you're constantly afraid, where the person you once loved becomes your captor. And imagine, on the night you finally find the courage to leave, you realize that leaving might mean dying. Margaret took the stand, her voice trembling as she recounted the months leading up to Daniel's death. He controlled every part of my life. He told me if I ever left, he would ruin me. He would take everything I had. She claimed that on the night of the shooting, Daniel had snapped. He had shoved her against the wall, screamed at her, and told her she would never leave him alive. She said she had no choice but to grab the gun. I was terrified. I just wanted him to stop. Her daughter, Rebecca, also testified. My mother was scared of him. She wanted to leave, but she was too afraid. The defense argued that Margaret had no financial struggles, no reason to kill Daniel for money. Instead, they claimed she had suffered in silence for years and had only acted when her life was in danger. Would the jury believe her? After 2 weeks of emotional testimonies and expert analysis, the jury was sent to deliberate. The prosecution had presented a strong case for murder, the life insurance policy, the suspicious crime scene, the forensic inconsistencies. But the defense had countered with a compelling case for self-defense. Margaret's injuries, the history of alleged abuse, and her emotional testimony. For 3 days the jury deliberated. Some jurors saw a premeditated crime, others saw a desperate act of survival. Then finally the verdict was in. Margaret Holloway stood as the judge read the verdict. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. We, the jury, find the defendant. Pause. Guilty of manslaughter. Not murder, but manslaughter. The jury had believed that Margaret had acted in fear, but they didn't believe it was purely self-defense. They believed she had options other than killing Daniel but had chosen to pull the trigger anyway. Margaret slumped slightly, closing her eyes as the weight of the verdict sank in. The judge sentenced her to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 8 years. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Some believed justice had been served, others felt the punishment was too harsh, while Daniel's family believed she had gotten away with murder. As Margaret was led away in handcuffs, she turned briefly to look at her daughter. Rebecca had tears in her eyes but nodded at her mother. Daniel's sister, Emily Carter, spoke outside the courthouse. She had a plan. She wanted him dead and now she's paying the price. But 15 years? That's nothing. My brother is gone forever. The case left the town divided. Some saw Margaret as a woman who had endured years of abuse and finally snapped. Others believed she had manipulated the system and gotten away with murder. The truth? It depended on who you asked. But one thing was certain: Margaret Holloway's story would haunt Dayton for years to come. The case of Margaret Holloway and Daniel Carter was more than just a tragic crime. It was a story of love, control, and deadly consequences. What started as a secret affair between a vulnerable woman and her caregiver ended in bloodshed, a courtroom battle, and a town divided. Margaret claimed she had no choice, that she had acted out of fear. The prosecution argued she had everything to gain from Daniel's death. In the end, the jury found her guilty of manslaughter, sentencing her to 15 years behind bars. But was justice truly served? Some believe Margaret was a victim, a woman who had endured years of emotional and physical torment, forced to make an impossible choice. Others see a calculating woman who carefully set the stage for murder, using fear as her defense. We may never know the full truth. What really happened that night? Did Margaret act in self-defense? Or was this a premeditated crime disguised as desperation? One thing is certain: this case is a chilling reminder that love and obsession can be a deadly combination. What do you think? Was Margaret a victim or a murderer? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life crime stories. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, sometimes the greatest dangers come from the ones we trust the most.